problem?
Nope. So you can hear me, right?
Yeah. Just like, so let's going to begin. Give me a sec. All right. So very good evening, Professor Carl, and wonderful to see you after a long time online. And we are very thankful that you have accepted our request, which was and we were in touch for many months regarding this particular talk. So I'm happy that this is going to take place today. Let me introduce you, and then uh, we have our students. So just we have circulated your poster. Everyone has your poster, but still, I would you should allow me to introduce yourself, introduce to the all the participants. So Professor Carl Landauer is an independent scholar thought. He taught history at Yale University, Stanford University, McGill University, and many other universities he's associated. And he is an eminent international lawyer based at San Francisco. He was a former lecturer at UC Berkeley and visiting assistant professor McGill University and former lecturer to the Stanford University. He has taught international legal theory at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He holds a JD degree from Harvard Law School and a PhD degree in history from Yale University. What a great combination. Harvard and Yale both are there for your LLM. That's wonderful. He holds a JD, and his notable works are published in Yale Journal of Law and the Humanities, Indian Journal of International Law, Leiden Journal of International Law, London, and Review of International Law in European Journal of International Law. Uh, so we are very happy that Professor, we had an opportunity, and the topic which for today's discussion is very interesting. So many of you may be aware, and I also encourage all of you uh, to look into the Indian Yearbook of International Affairs, which was started by Professor Alexandrowicz. He came as he was the founder member of the LLM program in the Madras University in the Constitutional Law and International Law. He was invited by the then Vice Chancellor on the suggestion of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru that he should be invited India for the establishing a center where he will take the constitutional law and international law. This is in a very unique combination which he started. He stayed almost 10 years, a decade in India, 49 to 59 he was here. And why I'm saying to all the participants that you look into the Indian Yearbook of International Affairs, because that contains a lot of interesting articles which are generally rare or which are not available, and even many authors have not worked on that approach. Even he has done on the constitution law, Indian constitution. He has around 100 pages he has written on the Indian constitution, and that is the project he did on behalf of the our institute, Indian Law Institute. So taking it further, Professor Carl, who has been working in his work on the Professor Alexandrowicz for last couple of years, and recently almost on the verge of completion of the, I believe, draft is ready, a paper he is working, and I requested him to come and share his idea on the work of the Professor Alexandrowicz. With this, I request Professor Carl to take the floor, and of course take the floor online, and and I request, if you say that we will have 45 to 50 minutes for you to speak, so if you find, You can anytime you can. So like we can go 45 to 50 minutes for you to speak. If you want beyond also, there's no restriction on that. And once you are through, then we can request all the participants to put questions to 10 to 15 minutes and there, because I believe it's a early morning for you, the early morning, and it's early in the early evening for all of us. So very good morning to you, and
Thank
very
you.
good thank you, and very good evening to all the participants who have joined us on the line. Over to you, Professor Carr.
Thank you. And by the way, this should take, this is an hour timing. So I wanted to thank you very much for the introduction, and of course the Indian Law Institute for the invitation. And I'm very privileged to talk to so many interested people. So thank everybody for joining in. And now I'm going to talk on C.H. Alexandrowicz's India and the Kautilyan tradition. I want to start with the 1980 Indian Yearbook of International Affairs. It's good that you mentioned that. A journal that the Polish via London historian of international law, C.H. Alexandrowicz, founded and edited during his decade as first professor of international and constitutional law at the University of Madras. The 1980 issue published papers presented at the Grotian Society, the society for which Alexandrowicz was the moving force, and this issue included Alexandrowicz's paper on the role of treaty making in the partition of Africa. It was published 5 years after his death in 1975. T.S. Rama Rao had taken over as editor. He opened the 1980 volume with a tribute to Alexandrowicz. About Alexandrowicz's research, he told us that, quote, though he came with a background of studies in Western universities, the inadequacy of library resources in Madras, especially in the area of modern international law, did not deter him. With canny skill, he spotted out and concentrated attention on the debates of the Indian Constituent Assembly in the areas of constitutional law and the unpublished archives in the record offices of Madras, Cochin, and other places, which revealed to him a fund of material on the practice of international law from the 16th century onwards by the Indian rulers. In this sentence, which Rao makes sound like an instance of serendipity, we find two of Alexander's major areas of publication, the history of international law and Indian constitutional development. Almost no one seems to have noticed that in 1958, Alexandrowicz published a bibliography of Indian law. It may be a slim volume of only 77 pages, but it has sections of bibliographic essay and publication lists for topics like personal law, civil law, criminal law, and industrial and labor law, in addition to what we might expect for Alexandrowicz, sections on international and comparative law. The volume gives testimony to Alexandrowicz's broad and intense interest in Indian law. Beyond the scope of today's paper, which is Alexandrowicz's vision of an Indian law of nations tradition based on Kautilyan, the Kautilya's Arthashastra, I will focus on the independent India of his writings on Indian constitutional developments in 1957. That's a 1957 publication. There are important values that inhabit both, including a valorization of secularization, nationalism, tolerance, commerce, and expertise. In a later project, I plan to focus on Alexandrowicz's The Constitution, Nehru, and Ambedkar, tying Alexandrowicz's personal involvement in organizations of the interwar and wartime Polish government, as well as international organizations, to his writing on Indian constitutional developments. But in today's paper, we can see some of the core values in his writing on the Kautilyan tradition in the law of nations. For that, we look to Alexandrowicz's depiction of the European confrontation with the East, of Europeans becoming enmeshed in an existing network of commercial interaction, treaty relations established on an equal basis, divisible sovereignty, and progressive secularization. To those principles, Alexandrowicz increasingly focused on Kautilyan principles. His identification of the environment and values of East Asia, by which he meant India and the further India of India-influenced Southeast Asia, was central to the Hague lectures he gave in 1960. In the Hague lectures, he referenced Kautilya only briefly for an exposition of the mandala, the grouping of states in relation to each other, which he and other Western scholars associated with the concept of balance of power. Only with Alexandrowicz's 1965-66 British Yearbook of International Law article and his expansion of the Hague Lectures into his book of 1967, An Introduction to the History of the Law of Nations in the East Indies, did Alexandrowicz truly focus on Kautilya in his depiction of the Indian law of nations. It is striking to remember that the text of Kautilya's Arthashastra was only recovered when a copy was delivered to the Mysore Government Library, and its curator, R. Shamasastri, published translated portions in 1905, a full Sanskrit text in 1909, and a full translation in 1915. The publication was momentous for Indians for reimagining their place in the history of the state. The Arthashastra was easily adapted for nationalist uses as a retort to long-held commonplaces about Indian politics, such as the trope of Indian politics as being fundamentally religious, as expressed from Hegel and passing through Weber. Today, I will work through various 20th century constructions of Kautilya to help place Alexandrowicz. An important reading of Kautilya focused on his pessimism about human nature. Numerous writers viewed him as providing an answer to the basic anarchical tendency in classical Indian political terminology, the law of the fish, as we find in Alexandrowicz. In this context, I will describe comparisons between Kautilya and Hobbes, yet the most significant comparative figure was with Machiavelli. Writers hasten to compare Kautilya and Machiavelli, judging whether he represented a harsher or a softer version of the popular trope of the depraved immorality of the prince. Here, it's easy to forget that Weber, in his famous 1918 Politics as a Vocation lecture, said that, quote, genuine, and remember, this is just after the Arthashastra was translated, that, quote, genuine radical Machiavellianism in the popular sense of the word is to be found in Indian literature centuries before the Christian era, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, purportedly from the time of Chandragupta. Machiavelli's own The Prince is harmless by comparison, end quote. But in the realm of social science, numerous scholars pointed to Machiavelli's scientism in the creation of modern social science, and this is particularly important to Alexandrowicz's Kautilya. Indeed, scientism and secularization were extremely important to Alexandrowicz's reading of the Kautilyan tradition. Here, he and others were working against the commonplace of Indian culture and politics as fundamentally religious and irrational. And the very rationality of the Kautilyan tradition tied in Alexandrowicz's mind to commercialism. This is central to his portrait of the Indian law of nations. From there, I will turn to the mandala theory, the divisibility of sovereignty and the balance of power. This merges with Alexandrowicz's most prized of classical law of nations writer, Grotius. It will also feed into the traits he most valorized in the newly constitutional independent India, the importance of state action as he underscored Nehruvian developmentalism, secularization in siding with Ambedkar and Ambedkar's religious critique of caste, the divisibility of sovereignty as he discussed the federalism of the new Indian state, and of course, rationality. Alexandrowicz has been largely known and pilloried for the so-called Alexandrowicz thesis, his argument about the impact of the East on the law of nations of the West. Alexandrowicz describes a basic framework for the East, particularly in his 1967 book, An Introduction to the Law of Nations in the East Indies. He is also known for the fall and rise narrative of international law, in which the classic, and that's his word, medieval and early modern European writers held to a natural law theory, viewing all polities internationally as subject to the same universal legal norms. And, quote, according to its natural law premises, was a universal and non-discriminatory law operating irrespective of civilization, religion, race, or continent, end quote. And he ties this to his vision of the interstatal law of East Asia. A line of Alexandrowicz's publications, interestingly, including an article in the in-house journal of the French Annales School edited by Fernand Braudel, in fact, the same issue in which Foucault published his only contribution to that journal. Each of those publications depict European powers following Vasco da Gama's landfall engaged with a developed interstatal system in the East. In the Hague lectures, Alexandrowicz wrote, quote, the European newcomer in Asia in the 16th century found themselves faced with a precise network of interstate connections, end quote. Indeed, the Europeans were doomed to be caught in this network. Quote, in the process of establishing their first settlements in India, the Portuguese soon discovered their inability to deal with local communities on the basis of inapplicable legal titles such as discovery, occupation, or the title of papal donation of overseas territories. All the major communities in India, as elsewhere in the East Indies, were politically organized, end quote. Alexandrowicz maintained in his East Indies book, quote, thus in the East Indies, a confrontation of two worlds took place on a footing of equality, and the ensuing commercial political transactions, far from being in a legal vacuum, were governed by a law of nations as adjusted to local interstate custom, end quote. I want to emphasize the importance of equality and tolerance. For Alexandrowicz wrote that, quote, references to the position of foreigners in Hindu states indicate the spirit of tolerance and the non-discrimination with which they were treated, end quote. Xenophobia, he argued, was in principle alien to Indian society, particularly in further India, where the caste system was rejected. Indeed, it tolerated settlements of foreign traders who were allowed to govern themselves by their own law, which led Alexandrowicz's discussion of the importance of capitulations in East Asia, which existed in Asia long before the arrival of the Europeans. It is essential here to emphasize, to put that the emphasis is on commerce. He opened his French article by citing J.C. Van Leur's work, which emphasized the existing commercial foundation of the Far East. Van Leur, in his essays in Asian social and economic history, drew our attention to the effort of European agencies to fit into this pattern. Indeed, quote, maritime law in the East Indies was based on a customary code of rules, end quote. And commercialism was closely aligned with secularism. Here, Alexandrowicz references, quote, separation of religious function from political power in Indian society, end quote, so that, quote, a logical consequence of this separation of power was the secularization of the royal function in the hands of the Kshatriyas, end quote. For him, the code of interstatal usages, quote, based on the Kautilyan and post-Kautilyan tradition, was in principle secular and allowed sovereigns in India and further India to maintain their regular relations inter se and later with Islamic rulers, as well as the European agencies, which first appeared in the East in the beginning of the 16th century, end quote. For Alexandrowicz, it was the influence of Hindu civilization that played such a prominent role in the development of East Indian trade. Throughout, he contrasts the secular to religious-based war, whether jihad or crusade, so that, quote, the reign of Mughal empires, Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, witnessed the victory of a secular policy of intergroup relations in India, end quote. In Asia, the Europeans confronted the mandala. Quote, the classical model of this network is based on the concept of the circle of states, that is to say, a group of states linked together by their common affairs of peace and war, which found their expression in the bonds of alliance and neutrality, end quote. It was a policy of balance of power within the complicated network of alliances and conflicts conceived in circles of interest. Critical for the survival of the mandala was a restriction against the complete destruction of one's enemies in war. Instead, there were not only shifting alliances, but also shifting suzerain vassal relationships. Alexandrowicz maintained, quote, what is characteristic in the suzerain vassal concept is that it was not conceived as aiming at the absorption of vassals by suzerains, which would not have served the idea of unity in diversity. Significantly, the vassal ruler was not to be subject to suppression or debillatio. Alexandrowicz contends, quote, the European agencies in the East learned the lesson of coexistence of Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity in India, and transplanted their experience to the West, which had been so long incapable of extricating itself from the obsession of religious wars, end quote. For him, Grotius and the Portuguese Freitas were the, quote, classic witnesses of legal issues relating to the East Indies in the early 17th century. Indeed, it is possible to assume, quote, that Grotius, in formulating his doctrine of the freedom of the sea, found himself encouraged by what he learned from the study of Asian maritime custom, end quote. His Grotius inculcated equality between states, commercialism, secularization, and the divisibility of sovereignty. Alexandrowicz's Kautilyan Principles article inserts India and the East into the creation story of international law. Quote, the historian of the law of nations who intends to ascertain the totality of factors which contributed to the development of our system of international law cannot confine his inquiry to pre-19th century Europe alone, end quote. In identifying the Kautilyan tradition, Alexandrowicz focuses on Kautilya as an historical figure. He wrote, quote, until Kautilya, Chandragupta Maurya's chancellor, completed his treatise in the 4th century BC, politics had not been an independent science in India, but remained largely a branch of social ethics, end quote. Of course, Kautilya stood in a progression of Indian thought, but ultimately, Alexandrowicz ties the Arthashastra to a key historical figure of the Mauryan Empire. Shama Shastri, in the intro to his translation, found sufficient evidence to maintain that Kautilya overthrew the Nandas and placed Chandragupta on their throne. His translation was, however, followed by an ongoing debate over the authorship of the Arthashastra, some about dating the Arthashastra, others about the author's identity, including that between what current scholar Mark McGill identified as champions and opponents of the unitary authorship thesis. The debate started early when Kalidas Naga published Les théories diplomatiques de l'Inde ancienne et l'Arthashastra in 1923. He wrote regarding Shamastrastri's attribution of authorship, quote, a careful examination of the different parts of the text obliges us to conclude that the hypothesis was unsupportable. By the time Indian Sanskrit scholar R.P. Kangal produced his 3 volumes in the 1960s, text, translation, and commentary, he devoted 59 pages to author and date. He basically agreed with Shama Shastri and, for example, refutes arguments based on discrepancies between the Greek Megasthenes observations about Mauryan India and the Arthashastra. If the major French Sanskrit scholar Robert Lingat simply threw up his hands in an aside, the date or dates of which are in debate, Mark McGill, in his recent book, provides the most convincing analysis of Kautilya's Arthashastra's authorship and dating. He provides us a thorough structural, stylistic, statistical, subject matter, and attitudinal analysis. For example, he points to the alteration of prose and verse, the uneven division of the Arthashastra's books, suggesting later imposed divisions, and compares the tenor of different sections in the text. For him, the shlokas were later emendations to a pre-existing text, as he gives us a redaction history of Arthashastra. McGill argues, for him, the early source text, quote, operated from a political philosophy in which the king's sovereign power was unconstrained by any prior legal or moral constraints. During the redaction, the political theology of the sacred laws and of the social classes which understood sovereign power to be governed by dharma as moral law was brought into the text, end quote. The point is that the source document, which he calls the Dantaniti, came from a separate secular political tradition that developed mostly independently of the Dharmashastra tradition. I've introduced McGill's findings about Kautilya's Arthashastra not to impeach Alexandrowicz's scholarship. Indeed, Alexandrowicz was adopting the prevalent view. It was the view, for example, of Kangal. If Alexandrowicz could cite scholars like Naga, who did not endorsed the unitary author view, he didn't reference them on that point. Significantly, U.N. Goschel, a towering figure in the history of Indian political thought and important to Alexandrowicz, adopted the traditional view. We see that in his History of Hindu Political Theories of 1923, where he wrote an agreement that Kautilya's treatise is generally assigned to the period of Chandragupta Maurya's reign, circa 322 to 298 BC. And he writes a good deal about the Arthashastra tradition from which Kautilya was drawing. Then, when he expanded and rewrote his 1923 study, into as a history of Indian political ideas in 1959, he may have softened the identification of Kautilya as the chief minister of Chandragupta, citing only to the, quote, orthodox tradition, which attributes the authorship to the work to a well-known minister of Chandragupta. Still, he envisioned an historical Kautilya. A.S. Altekar, in his State and Government in Ancient India, also important to Alexandrowicz, maintained that we could place Kautilya in the Mauryan period. Finally, K.A. Nilakanta Sastry, who taught in Chennai and contributed to Alexandrowicz's Indian Yearbook of International Affairs, wrote in his introduction to the Age of Nandas and Mauryas, quote, "The Arthashastra of Kautilya holds a place in the literature of Indian policy corresponding to that of the Mauryan Empire in Indian history," end quote. Going back to Naga, regarding the political backdrop, he felt that the divisible sovereignty of the Arthashastra did not fit a Mauryan identification. Essentially, its atomistic politics were, quote, entirely contrary to one of great empire, end quote. But that point would mean little to Alexandrowicz, who was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was quite familiar with the divisibility of sovereignty and fragmentation in the context of empire. He could write, quote, "The Mughal Empire at the stage of its decentralization in the 18th century became a composite entity similar to the Holy Roman Empire," end quote. And I'd like to emphasize that Alexandrowicz certainly thought in terms of the political organization on the ground. I've dwelled on the unitary authorship issue less to suggest Alexandrowicz's seeming failure to acknowledge the debate. Rather, it served him well to see the Kautilyan tradition as one that could be personified and could have a champion alongside his Grotius. The discovery of Kautilya's Arthashastra represented a paradigm shift for Indians' vision of their own political history. Johannes Voigt tells us that the text caused a sensation and helped, quote, usher in a new Indian nationalist historiography, end quote. And he provides an example where he tells us of B.K. Sarkar's coining the term Dharmashastran, a combination of the Sanskrit term dharma and the German word for state, meaning by it what is called in German Rechtsstaat, end quote. As McGill observed, quote, "The authoritative disquisitions of the Arthashastra were decisive proof of the kind of native political capacity that India was accused of lacking and proved to be of great value for a people consciously developing a self-assertive national identity," end quote. Goschel in 1923 shows that he was struggling against headwinds, quoting the 19th century French professor of moral science Paul Janet to the effect that the Orient in general, India in particular, did not conceive the idea of the state. And he quoted Westell Woodbury Willoughby's Political Theories of the Ancient World to the effect that the civilization of Eastern cultures, quote, appealed to dogma rather than to reason, to faith rather than to logically founded belief, end quote. Against these stereotypes, Goschel could argue, although not entirely dispatching the importance of religion, the, quote, particular genius of the Indo-Aryans left its impress upon another aspect of Hindu political thought, namely its intensely realistic character, end quote. Thus, when Goschel came to publish his expanded book in 1959, over a decade into Indian independence, he could write with satisfaction of a growing appreciation of the abiding value of secular aspects of non-European civilizations in Western lands. He writes, quote, "The greatest single contribution made by our ancient authors to the reasoned treatment of political ideas lies to the credit of the schools and teachers of Arthashastra, and Kautilya here has pride of place. So we can praise Kautilya on the striking characteristic of his genius, namely his sense of balance and harmony. In Indian writers on politics and government in the East, and India in particular, they were forced to refute the charge of over-religiosity. Indian writers on international law had the additional burden of addressing the core assumptions of state membership in international law restricted to the Christian West. Pramathanath Bandyopadhyay, in International Law and Custom in Ancient India in 1920, counters the favored monopoly of the European family, exclaiming, quote, "It is, however, the object of this thesis to establish the apparent incredible fact that the ancient Indians had a definite knowledge of the rules of international law according to which they regulated their international conduct," end quote. And he underscored the failures of international law in the West, that modern Westerners had, quote, "in their cynical disregard of the rights of others, as it has been evidenced during the last great World War, in violation of Luxembourg and Belgium, in the compulsory enlistment of Greece, after the violation of neutrality, in the utter disregard for the rules of civilized warfare, in the curtailment of the rights of non-combatants to the lowest limits," end quote. By comparison, the ancient Indians had 2,000 years before Grotius, a Rachel, or an Ayala, recalled Europe to humanity, propounded a body of rules governing the relations between different states into which the continent of India was generally divided, end quote. Similarly, S.V. Viswanatha opened his international law in ancient India in 1925, stating, quote, "The subject of the following book was suggested to me by the Great War of 1914, which witnessed rather sweeping changes in the European law of nations," end quote. For Viswanatha, quote, "one point of difference which becomes clear to us between ancient Indian international law and the modern European law of nations is that whereas the rules of law are based on the common consent of the states which came within the bounds of law, in the case of the former, the rules of conduct embodied in Dharma had to be implicitly obeyed by all nations in India," end quote. And to the stale criticism that Indians engaged in an idealized vision, Viswanatha responded that the works formulated a code of laws which approached the actual to no less an extent than the code of Grotius, or even the code formulated at The Hague. Alexandrowicz tells us of an all India seminar held in 1960 at the University of Delhi, which concerned itself with the possible contribution of Indian law to the development of international law. So Alexandrowicz tells us, quote, "The seminar concentrated on a number of problems, such as the significance of Pacta sunt servanda and in Dharma Shastra and Arthashastra, the importance of mandala as an expression of balance of power, the role of the principle of nonviolence, the settlement of conflict by third-party judgment, and the record of diplomacy and negotiation to the limit," end quote. Alexandrowicz complains his act of deflation here, observing, quote, "What the participants of the seminar failed to consider is the point in time in which Indian traditions of interstate conduct were still capable of exercising a direct influence on our system of the law of nations, and he saw that faltering at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries." Here, Alexandrowicz took quite a different tact from Nagendra Singh's 1969 India and International Law. Singh, in a quick march through various principles of international law, such as Pacta sunt servanda and the role of missions, tied them to the Indian past with the Code of Manu, the Mahabharata, and Kautilya's Arthashastra, providing precedents for international law writ large. But he saw Kautilya as more of an observer than a generative mind. He wants to steer us away from any theory of brute force, so he concludes with the promotion of peace as core to Indian thought and practice, and introduces the concept of peaceful coexistence, or Panchil, advocated by modern India, quoting a speech by Nehru at length. By comparison, Alexandrowicz, in what looks like a more historical point, ties his discussion to the fall and rise narrative of the law of nations from the height of medieval, early modern naturalism to European positivism with its xenophobia and colonial abuses of the 19th century, and potentially only rising again in the mid-20th century. As a touchstone for Indian political thought, many writers have pointed to the discussion of the law of the fish in the Santa Parvan. For example, Ghoshal in 1923 wrote, "If the king, says Bisma, did not exist in this world as a wielder of punishment, the stronger would devour the weaker in the fashion of fishes living in the water." End quote. Similarly, Altekar wrote of a falling of grace in the text. Quote, "The Santa Parvan goes on to narrate that society flourished without a king or law court for a long time, but later somehow there was a moral degeneration. The people fell from rectitude. Greed, selfishness, and cupidity began to stay their mind, and the earlier paradise was soon converted into a veritable hell." End quote. For Altekar, the law of the jungle began to prevail. The strong devoured the weak, as is the order of the day among the fish. And here the gods intervene to bestow kingship. But Altekar offers that elsewhere in the Santa Parvan, that, quote, "people were tied to the law of the jungle, which prevailed for a long time and entered into a contract that persons guilty of unsocial acts like misappropriation and adultery would be expelled from society." End quote. In both cases narrated by Altekar, the Santa Parvan envisioned human society emerging out of anarchy. U.S. scholar John Spellman, in his political theory of ancient India in 1964, wanted to emphasize this anarchy talk of Indian political thought. Quote, "In ancient India, the fear of anarchy was almost pathological." End quote. This was central to the Indian institution of kingship. Quote, "Without understanding this idea, there can be no understanding of kingship in ancient India." End quote. India was marked by a paranoid style of politics, and he marshals words like horror and fright. Hiralal Chatterjee, in his 1958 International Law and Interstate Relations in Ancient India, felt compelled to dismiss any notion that the law of the fish represented an important historical stage, seeing it at most as a temporary phase. In essence, Spellman, the US-based Orientalist, offered up a pathological diagnosis, while Chatterjee defensively assured readers that the law of the fish had no significant historical reality. Coincidentally, Alexandrowicz brings Chatterjee and Spellman together for their shared rejection of a popularly derived social contract theory of kingship. He does this in a footnote using Chatterjee and Spellman to rebut, quote, "the theory that sovereignty in the Hindu state was vested in the people," end quote. Alexandrowicz writes that, quote, "unlike the Buddhist doctrine, which tends to see the foundations of the state in quasi-contractual relationship between ruler and people, Kautilya, in a Brahmanist parentheses or Hobbesian end parentheses way, is a pessimist and sees government as a remedy to the universal anarchy or the law of the fish, according to which the stronger swallows up the weaker," end quote. Alexandrowicz here focuses on Danda. If the sovereign does not use the rod, it gives rise to the law of the fish. We have here, then, a Hobbesian Kautilya without the social contract overlay and married to Brahmanism. For Alexandrowicz, quote, "according to Kautilya's Arthashastra, politics were, to a great extent, divorced from the tenets of Dharma and governed by considerations of expediency." Nevertheless, he explained that, quote, "in the theory, the rules of Dharma prevailed over those of Artha, and appeared as a modifying factor to the rules of expediency." He turns to a specific Hobbesian reference point. Quote, "as to the nature of inter-sovereign relations, Kautilya did not conceive it in terms of ideal postulates as it was in the scholastic or Grotian law of nature, but in terms similar to the political doctrine of Hobbes, that is, as the reality of human conflicts and self-preservation," end quote. Here he has returned to the anarchical society. Thus, Kautilya concerns himself with the formulation of certain rules which could mitigate the catastrophic effects of anarchy, end quote. And we see an answer to the circle of in the circle of states. For Roger Boscha, writing on Kautilyan in 2003, Hobbes is important. It appears in his subtitle calls Kautilyan the first great political realist. Furthermore, quote, the king's first duty, just as it was for Hobbes's sovereign, is to destroy the enemies and protect his own people, end quote. For Bosch's Kautilya, quote, the king must protect his people from chaos within, a sort of Hobbesian state of war, or as Kautilya said, a condition when the law of the fishes applies, that is, when the big fish eat the little fish and all is violent turmoil, end quote. Here Boscha introduces Spellman's account of the ancient Indian fear of anarchy that was almost pathological. So he quotes him directly. That is the background for Boscha, as it was for Spellman. Boscha wants to underscore the Hobbesian comparison. The best European comparison is with Hobbes, who also tried to outline timeless laws by means of a science of politics. And he asserts both Hobbes and Kautilyan, quote, believed that the foundation of any science of politics must be of clarity of language and crystal clear definition of words, a model that Hobbes found in the deductive mathematics of Euclid, while Kautilyan was doing something similar, end quote. Ultimately, however, Boscha is more interested in Machiavelli, who appears on the very first page of his introduction, and it is the ruthless Machiavelli. In terms of frank and often brutal advice to the king, Kautilyan makes Machiavelli seem mild. That's Boscha. If we think of the two source components of McLish's Arthashastra that led many commentators to talk about vacillation or ambivalence, here Boscha comes down on the side of an immoderate Kautilyan. Many commentators on Kautilyan, even those writing sympathetic portraits, dwelled on Kautilyan's counsels of deception and ruthlessness. Goschel, for example, explained that in a section of the Arthashastra on the suppression of disturbers of peace, quote, Kautilya coolly suggests in one place that spies in disguise may mix with thievish foresters and instigate them to attack companies of merchants and villagers, and may contrive the assassination of those people with weapons and with poison. Indeed, spies are prominent in writings on Kautilyan. No one seems to leave them out, but Boscha devotes an entire section to Kautilya's spy state. I would like to move from the pessimistic realist of Kautilyan to more complicated comparisons with Niccolo Machiavelli. Overall, Alexandrowicz pays little attention to Machiavelli. His Kautilyan Principles article engages a range of Kautilya's values without reference to Machiavelli, and only once does Machiavelli's name appear, although rather obliquely, stating that, quote, Yusti seems perfectly aware of the concept of mandala, whether in its Kautilyan or Machiavellian version, end quote. Nevertheless, the Machiavelli comparison was critical in the reception history of Kautilyan, and there were many Machiavellis, just as there were many Kautilyans. So it's worth briefly mapping the comparisons, particularly by authors important to Alexandrowicz. Already in 1923, Goschel had to consider the fashionable, that's his word, comparison between Kautilyan and Machiavelli. I mentioned Weber's 1918 description of Kautilyan as a genuine radical Machiavellianism in the popular sense of the word. In essence, this falls in line with the Machiavels of Elizabethan literature, notably Shakespeare's Richard III. Certain Indian proponents of Kautilyan felt the need to rush to his defense. Viswanatha in 1925 wrote, quote, it is because Arthashastra subordinates considerations of morality to expediency and practical gain that Kautilyan has been styled the Indian Machiavelli. After quoting directly from Machiavelli to the effect that in war the use of fraud was admirable and praiseworthy, Viswanatha intones, quote, this is by no means identical with that of Kautilyan and other Indian writers, end quote. Naga in 1923 referred to this so-called Hindu Machiavel, ce soi-disant Machiavel Hindu, and asserted that Kautilyan was not immoral and war was a last resort for him. Some of the harsher Kautilyan Machiavellian comparisons would be carried forward, including by Indian writers. Nagendra Singh, not a Kautilyan enthusiast, wrote, quote, if the theory of brute force based on Machiavellian tactics has been advocated in Arthashastra by writers like Kautilya, its position in strict law has to be examined in relation to the principles of Dharmashastra, end quote. Here he pushed the role of Dharma. Quote, in fact, the supremacy of Dharmashastra was so well established that all important literature on Arthashastra itself recognized Dharma, or law, as the highest objective. Indeed, even, and the even is important here, Kautilya's Arthashastra categorically states that, quote, in any manner where there is a conflict between Dharmashastra and the practice, or between the Dharmashastra and any secular transaction, the king should decide the matter by relying on Dharma alone, end quote. In 1923, Ghoshal, after marking the fashionable Machiavelli comparison, advises his readers that Kautilya had evidently a wider scope than the treatises of Machiavelli, who confines his attention to the art of government alone. On method, he points to their shared empiricism and observes that, quote, the empirical method of Machiavelli, supported as it is by frequent references to the history of classical antiquity, has some resemblance to the empiricism of Kautilya, which is fortified by occasional references to the Indian traditional history. But Ghoshal is compelled to address the immorality issue. The stakes are high, and he placed so much emphasis on Kautilya in preparing the way for the, quote, wholesale incorporation of the Arthashastra material into the system of the Brahmanical canon, end quote. A concession to the Kautilya critics, he wrote, finally, as regards the attitude of these authors towards religion and morality, it appears at first sight that Kautilya rivals and even surpasses Machiavelli in his sacrifice of these principles to the end of public welfare. Quote, nevertheless, it has to be remembered that Kautilya reserves his immoral statecraft in general for extreme cases, and he advocates, as in his rules relating to the acquisition of territory, the kind and even benign treatment of the subjects, end quote. Ghoshal, in his expanded 1959 overview of Indian political thought from 1500 BCE to 1300 CE, before a subsection specifically on Kautilya and Machiavelli, wrote, quote, we may sum up the discussion by saying that if Kautilya upholds in some lines of his policy the high authority of the Brahmanical canon, he allows himself in other directions, under the dominant influence of the Arthashastra tradition, to make religion the instrument of statecraft, or in other words, sacrifice theology at the altar of politics, end quote. Essentially, Ghoshal combined McClish's two poles in the portrait of a unitary author. He does not eliminate the immoral in Kautilya, but he also wants to press that the worst in Kautilya related to his policy toward highly disaffected and dangerous elements of the kingdom, as well as the enemy outside. I want to focus on Goshal's comparison to Machiavelli as the first modern political philosopher in European history. In terms of method, quote, the empirical method of Machiavelli, supported as it is by frequent references to the history of classical antiquity, has its parallel in the empiricism of Kautilya, which is fortified by his occasional references to Indian traditional history. I would also like to reference a Machiavellian trait in Kautilya's thought in taking advantage of public emotion in both Goshal's book, referring to psychology. In 1923, after discussing the restraining role of punishment in Kautilya, Ghoshal refers comparatively to the Mahabharata and the Manusamhita. The idea mentioned, namely, that punishment is the great instrument of social order, receives a psychological setting in a third verse, which is found alike in the Mahabharata and the Manusamhita. Psychology as a term is more prevalent in Goshal's 1959 study. They are talking about Kautilya's pessimistic anthropology. He writes that his argument, quote, involves the application of human psychology to politics namely that men are predominantly evil, end quote. After describing Kautilya's explanation of popular superstitions for political ends, he writes of Kautilya's application of mob psychology to politics. Kautilya is associated with an emblematic 20th century term, psychology, but also with Kautilya's manipulation of religious sentiment. Ghosh has flipped the role. He has flipped the role of religion in politics. This makes Kautilya the secular peer of Machiavelli. Despite the constant comparisons, excuse me, of Machiavelli and Kautilya in the literature, the comparison was not an explicit part of Alexander's narrative frame. Nevertheless, the prevalent values in that comparison, rationalism, modernization, and secularization, were central to Alexandrowicz. And the linking of modernization and secularization, those Weberian trends contra Weber, is worth appreciating as background for the place of modernization and secularization in Alexander's Indian Constitution book, where he follows Ambedkar's struggle for secularization and the disciplining of the role of caste. If Machiavelli was not an explicit touchpoint for Alexandrowicz, the Machiavellian Kautilya of writers like Ghosh plays into Alexandrowicz's Kautilya. Alexandrowicz's Hague lectures largely focused on the mandala in Kautilya. Quote, one of the problems of primary significance before Kautilya was that of unity and diversity in the Indian subcontinent, particularly the reconciliation of the dynastic interests of hundreds of rulers who had their place on the political map of India, end quote. In a footnote, Alexandrowicz underscores the contemporary relevance for India, observing that, quote, the problem of unity and diversity is solved in present-day India by adoption of a federal structure in the framework of which various linguistic communities enjoy separate statehood under the control of the federal center, end quote. Specifically referencing the mandala, Kautilya's Arthashastra advocated the policy of so-called mandala, that is, the policy of balance of power within the complicated network of alliances and conflicts conceived in circles of interest, end quote. It is intimately linked with a view, this is for Alexandrowicz, with a view of suzerain-vassal relations that enjoyed the, quote, the absorption of vassals by suzerains which would not have served the idea of unity and diversity, end quote. In essence, the vassal ruler was not to be subject to complete suppression. We have some of the main strokes of Alexander's Kautilyan portrait: divisibility of sovereignty, the mandala as a sustaining system, the network of suzerain vassal relationships, and a prohibition on the obliteration of the defeated opponent. Regarding the mandala, Alexandrowicz observed that Kautilya concerned himself with the formulation of certain rules which could mitigate the catastrophic effects of anarchy, end quote. This is a Hobbesian anarchical note, and it played out in an Indian political map that was, quote, highly heterogeneous and decentralized one, end quote. And here's the but there were unifying factors within the diversity, a phenomenon mutatis mutandis, relevant in present-day Indian federal politics, end quote. Regarding the mandala, Alexandrowicz writes of, quote, the principle of individual responsibility of each sovereign within the collectivity or concert of all sovereigns in the circle of states for the maintenance of a provision of interstate order, which is essential to diminish the consequences of anarchy, end quote. And that interstate order meant that sovereignty was ultimately divisible. And here, his Kautilya becomes his Grotius. As Hedley Bull pointed out, quote, the members of the International Society, in the view of Grotius, are not merely states or the rulers of states, end quote. Alexandrowicz distinguished Grotius and Kautilya when he writes, quote, as to the nature of inter-sovereign relations, Kautilya did not conceive of it in terms of the ideal postulates, as it was in the scholastic or Grotian law of nature, but in terms similar to the doctrine of Hobbes, that is, as the reality of human conflicts and self-preservation, end quote. But when introducing Kautilya's Arthashastra in his Kautilyan Principles article, Alexandrowicz focused on Grotius with regard to the divorce of politics from moral philosophy. Quote, in terms of European philosophy, it might be comparable with the efforts of those theologians and lawyers who tried to extricate the jus gentium from the grip of theology. St. Thomas Aquinas was no doubt aware of the need for some separation of the two disciplines. But it was Grotius who made the first decisive effort to conceive of the law of nations as a discipline with an extensive with an existence independent from theology or metaphysics, end quote. This ties Alexandrowicz's view that, quote, perhaps the strongest influence of this ties to Alexandrowicz's view that perhaps the strongest influence of the Kautilyan tradition revealed itself in the trend towards the secularization of the law of nations in the Hindu sphere of influence in the East Indies, end quote. Secularization was tied to the expansion of trade. Quote, with the rapid development of European East Indian trade in the 17th century, doctrinal obstacles to treaty making tended gradually to disappear. The canon law prohibitions of treaty relations between Christian and non-Christian powers became meaningless in the law of nations, and treaty making was allowed to gather momentum. There is every reason to believe that the increasing volume of treaties between powers of different religion and cultural background contributed to the secularization, and that's italicized in Alexandrowicz, secularization of treaty law as such, end quote. Alexandrowicz also focused on divisible sovereignty, including referencing modern Indian federal politics in his East Indies book and pointing to modern India's providing a structure to address minorities. It is useful to remember Alexandrowicz's biography here. In conclusion, Alexandrowicz was born in Galicia, the Austro-Hungarian administrative region of Poland, in Lvov, now known as Lviv, in Ukraine, as the son of a general of the Austro-Hungarian Polish division. We note the backdrop of the earlier Polish positions and the complicated history and identity of Galicia with its competing populations. Alexandrowicz tells us that as a student in 1918, he participated in the independence movement in Szczecin, Silesia. After both practicing law and working as an academic in the interwar period, with the outbreak of World War II, he engaged in the defense of the city of Lviv, and from the Russian-occupied city moved to Bucharest, where he worked on the Committee for Protection of the State. In Bucharest, he was arrested by the Iron Guard and held for several weeks, and transited in 1940 through Istanbul to London. There, in addition to his being called to the bar and teaching, he worked for the Polish Treasury Ministry, for a Polish developmental bank, and was chair of the short-lived European Central Island Organization. So that's an international economic organization with its effort to fix the rail system. The India to which Alexandrowicz arrived in 1951, when he took up his chair at the recommendation of the University of London's David Hughes Parry, was just removed from the height of the blood-soaked partitions experience. And his Indian Constitution book is filled with the turmoil that the Constituent Assembly and judges after the adoption of the Constitution, judges in the 1950s had to contend with. Alexandrowicz's personal experience in Europe and in India of the 1950s provides an important backdrop for his reading of Kautilya and interstate relations. His Polish experience with even the interwar period full of violence and plebiscites, national minority tensions, and various coups is full of sources of popular anxieties. When Alexandrowicz tells of Kautilya's view of the state as an answer to threats of anarchy, he has seen it. Still, the Hobbesian and Machiavellian pessimistic anthropology are more prevalent in the Kautilya of other scholars. His Kautilya is more about important values that the East brought to the West, values based on rationalism, secularization, commerce, and the divisible sovereignty that he identified with his private hero, Grotius. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Karl, for a very detailed and comprehensive presentation. And I'm sure that we'll have more opportunity to go through, like, whatever we have learned today from your presentation. And this will also be, as you discussed with me, that you will publish this paper. We'll be very happy if you decide to give it to us or anywhere. So I leave it to you to choose. So that's not an issue, but we'll be very happy to publish in the Indian Journal of International Law, Indian Journal of the Indian Law Institute for one reason. I feel I make a request because the work of the Alexandrowicz, which you have identified some way, Indian scholars, like, almost forgotten. So hardly they were very few. If young scholars I ask, nobody has idea what Alexandrowicz has done. Nobody, very few has. I'll not say nobody. Very few have idea there is a Indian Yearbook of International Affairs, a copy of 10 volumes or 12 volumes available in the Indian Society of International. Maybe if you take a positive decision to contribute in the Journal of the Indian Law Institute, that will help in generating interest in the young scholars. Like Prabhakar is here, he's a great fan of yours, and he has also joined today for your talk. I think you know him personally. So he had also, yeah, Prabhakar is there. So this will be a good idea. Let me, I think if you permit, we can have a quick questions, 10-15 minutes, and then we can, I'll sum up. So over to you. Any one of you feel asking something on presentation of Professor Carl? Anyone can unmute and then start asking. No? Prabhakar, you would like to ask something or give your comments and observation?
Good evening, sir. May I ask a question, sir?
Yeah, that's I'm asking you. I request. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Sir, I'd like to ask a question about, the policy of Kautilya. Like, if we talk about Kautilya, uh, around 3,000 years ago, he gave such a wonderful theory about state administration, and he written so many things about state administration and economy. But, like, how far the theory is relevant in today's context, and more importantly, sir, like, as a researcher, from where we can get the authoritative version of Kautilya's work, because there are so many versions available in market, and I get confused, like, from where to read about Kautilya's work, sir. Thank you, sir.
So let me just say first about Kautilya. So the Arthashastra, which is part of a tradition, the full text arrived in 1905. So this is sort of like people knew that Kautilya existed. They saw him cited, etc. But this was brand new in 1905. There have been since then other manuscripts and slightly different. There's a different language manuscript as well. So part of it is figuring out what to use as the core text. Now, as an English translation, it was translated in 1905 by Shama Sastry, and that was based on just that first version of the Arthashastra by Kautilya. And then there have been other attempts to translate it. If you want to, I think there's a new annotated translation by Patrick Olivelle, Olivelle, and it's called King, Government, and Law in Ancient India, Kautilya's Arthashastra. And it's a pretty thick volume, but it's put out, but it's Oxford University Press. And I think he has an introduction about all the issues with relating to Kautilya. But there are other translations. There's Shama Sastri's, and there was Kangel's in the 1960s. And be careful, there's one, I've forgotten who did it. Yes, it's out by Penguin. And that translator changed the order of the, I think, translator's license he took to the extremity, that actually changes the order of the chapters, which is sort of like, huh, what? So I would steer you away from that one. But if you want an English translation, Patrick Olavel's is the best to look for. Now, in terms of the modern, what can we take from it? So part of it is figuring, part of it is its place in history, which, I've talked about. There's this rolling different views of Kautilya. And so the interesting thing is sort of like how he is taken up and how his Arthashastra was taken up by various figures and what they made of him. And so there's lots of uses of Kautilya in various ways. And so that's an interesting part of the background, sort of like reading the history and how history was used. And I think that's useful for us. Then in terms of, its real applicability, well, that would be something about going into it and seeing what you read, which actually sort of, has some relevance or tells us about something about human nature and politics and economy, but also what, part of it is, again, what about its historical framework? And remember, as McClish told us, this is something that was written, and then what we have is an emendation. So it's a big change. So from 4th century or so BCE to then a couple of centuries after the in the Common Era, it was revised. So but part of it is seeing what is it's saying about the past as well, and past views. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Just a kind of an observation, sir. Like, you talked about, the English translation of the Kautilya's work in 1905, and then you also, went ahead with suggesting about the work of the Penguin that changed the order. Thank you so much, sir, for your, detailed observation. And I wish to know a very important point here, because somewhere I read from Kautilya's work that he preferred reformative theory of punishment. There are various theories of punishment in criminal justice system. So Kautilya preferred, reform attitude. Like, a human being is ultimately, how to make use of the human resource. Like, suppose if we are putting a person behind the bar, it will not serve any purpose, right? So, like, what should be the theory of, what should be the model of punishment, so he, according to him, that I know, I may be wrong, that he talked about reformative attitude, reformative, aspect of criminal justice administration. But ultimately we see, like, we follow reformative, to a certain extent, but keeping in view, like, the increase in crime, terrorism, how far it is good for a nation to adhere to reformative, aspect of the punishments, because in the modern society, if we talk about reformation, then how do we address the challenges that is being imposed by terrorism and so many things, sir? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so I'm not going to give you a prescription
Yeah.
to say. Yeah, but yeah, oh, go ahead.
Okay, so Prabhakar, you like to ask something?
I did not have a question. I thought I should ask in the interim, since students were still thinking about how to frame their questions. But I'm still in the process of absorbing a very an extremely rich presentation by Karl. Of course, I've read his earlier works, and I've also read his works on Kautilya, and I'm still trying to digest all of that. So I'm still, wonderful presentation again, Karl, and we have a lot to learn from what you're presenting is Alexandrowicz's reading of Kautilya. So I'm still trying to digest all that you've said. I particularly appreciate the fact that, as most Indians, we don't speak French, and you've also used the French sources to kind of tell us what was happening in the French sphere about Kautilya's thought. You're mostly aware of what happens in the English sort of UK/US setup, but a lot was also happening in German as well as in French French intellectual tradition where they were trying to, the Orientalists were trying to read India. I mean, some of the leading Orientalists were Germans employed by the East India Company, Max Weber, Max Muller, and others. So of course, there's a huge tradition of how Kautilyan thought were read by continentals, not just the Americans. So I'm still processing what you have said. I have no questions at this point. Thank you for the nice presentation.
Thank you, Prabhakar. So I take the one question by Ritika. So she has in chat, she has given a question. So I read I would like to read if you say that, sir, Professor Karl, you have somewhere drawn a semblance between the thoughts of Machiavelli and Kautilya. I would like to know more of your thoughts on how they diffused religion with politics, and how, if we have either moved away from it or kind of is still following that.
Yeah, so you have to put each in their own context. And Kautilya, by the way, again, there are the sort of two pieces of Kautilya in the same text because of the emendations or changes. So in general, there's lots of things where he might say something in some place and something else in another place. But he also is talking to advising how to use religion. Now, religion is very important. He has lots of, there are all sorts of discussions of religion in the Arthashastra, but it's, there is, he's seen as someone who is taking religion out. So the Arthashastra is taking religion out of its primary role. It still has an important role. There's that religio-moral element that if we take McClish's theory correct, as correct, that there's a sort of it's an overlay on top of something that was meant to. So the Arthashastra was supposed to be a purely rational manual for very specific reasons, and then it gets the Dharma overlay later. So so there are, there's sort of these two fighting traditions within it. But it's not that even the purely rationalistic one was out without the importance of religion. So religion is always important on some level in Kautilya, less so for Machiavelli, obviously.
Anyone else? If you have question or something, I think. So I will take cue from the Prabhakar what he said. I am also trying to understand the entire, your presentation, and I have not gone much deeper, which he is doing that, but I'm just like superficially. But it's what very interesting presentation. You have focused on many aspects, personal law, civil law. Even you talked about, I think, power cut is there. You have discussed about the particularly all three phases, like an era. I think you started with the ancient, you focused on the 17th century, and then also you come to the final page. In three phases, how Alexandrowicz has looked into the Indian perspective, and that is very important. He simply did not confine himself to one era. He moved with the ancient. He tried to highlight the contribution of Kautilya, like Arthashastra, and try to see how evolution of international law has taken place. I believe that many of you will agree that the same way, some extent, and I'm sure you might have come across with the work of Professor R.P. Anand. He also is he looked into the more historical perspective of international law. Of course, he did not go into the Kautilya, but he said evaluation of international law, particularly in medieval time, and some also is there. So these are there. So you have many things you have spoke the like in your presentation, and I'm sure that these things will be very helpful to all young students who are here. So many of they are currently they are doing the master program in the Indian Law Institute, and some of them are PhD students. I believe strongly that your talk has motivated them, and I'm sure that days to come they will think about going to the Indian Society of International Law, going to the Indian Law Institute library to fetch out some works of the Alexandrowicz and also try to search your work and understand more in the subject. And this will help us in to remain in connect with you. And I wish that we'll be always in touch through the technology which has come into the place, and we'll be very happy to welcome you whenever you visit next time India. So you are welcome to visit the India. With this, I profusely thank you for your time, your excellent presentation, and end with the request you consider, like, our request of giving your paper to the Journal of the Indian Law Institute if you wish so. With this, I end here, and once again, thank you very much, Professor Kal, Professor Prabhakar, and I think all students from the ILI and other institute for joining us, and a wonderful evening for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
You. And thanks for everything.
Thank you very much. So if you permit, we can log out. I want to
Thank you, sir.
thank you. So very good morning. It's all right. So we log out now. Supervisor sometime come. So we can log out. Go.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.